So I think at this point it's very apparent that this is a very heavily music theory based channel, especially with some of the topics I've been covering, like symmetrical scales and reharmonization and polyrhythms, stuff like that. However, I do understand that a lot of you are just self-taught musicians who haven't really explored that world of scales and modes and chords. And of course, there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, you could become a great player just by playing the instrument and having a creative mind. I used to be a self-taught player for a long time before I decided to study at MI. Although I do hear from a lot of you, and I understand that a lot of you do want to explore this world and do want to learn a little bit of music theory, at least a little bit, or a lot if you get really interested in it. At this point, I'm just really interested in it, so I just like learning more and more about it. So because of that, I thought I'd start this little series. I don't know how consistent it'll be. It's just every once in a while I'll probably just cover a topic, and really the idea is I want to start from the bottom of music theory, like from the very first things you're typically taught, and then go on to more and more complex, progressively more and more complex things. Because I think the hardest part about learning on your own is that you don't really know what to learn first. So usually a lot of people will really want to get interested in like the exotic stuff right away, but the thing is you're not going to understand how to use any of that unless you learn about the more simple stuff first. So what I hope to do with this series is to provide you with a little place to begin and then just kind of build up from there. Now, before we get into any topics, I first want to discuss what exactly is music theory. In general, music theory is just our way of organizing and analyzing a piece of music in order to gain a deeper understanding of why it sounds the way it does, whether it has to do with the chords or the scales or the rhythmic patterns or whatever they use in each composition. So the reason I say that is because I find that a lot of people who start learning music theory feel like they're just being given all these rules and restrictions about how they can play music. And that's not the case at all. Of course, when you first start out learning about it, you're going to have to start with the more simpler stuff, but that doesn't mean that that's the only way you can write music. You can do pretty much whatever you want. Even now when I write my music, I don't really have all these music theory concepts in my head. I just kind of start writing like I did before. The only difference is if I play a weird chord or something that I like the sound of, I can just analyze it and say, oh, so I could play all these other scales over that and make it sound even more interesting. Now, the last thing you might be thinking to yourself is, do I need to learn music theory in order to become a good musician? And the thing is, it won't necessarily automatically make you a better musician. I mean, there's lots of things that go into becoming a good musician, which include like all the technical aspects on your instrument. And music theory is really just one part of the puzzle. However, what it will do is it'll give you plenty of more tools to work with when you are writing your own music. It'll increase what I like to call your sonic palette. Much like an artist's palette, you could think of like before you learn music theory, you have some good colors in there and they sound good as they are, but once you learn music theory, your palette expands and then you have tons of other intricate colors to work with. So really you could think of music theory as giving you the tools to become a better songwriter or a better musician, but it won't necessarily automatically make you a better musician. You still have to put in the work to practice and get better at your craft. But anyway, now I'm going to move on to the first topic I have, which is usually the very first building block that they give you in most music theory classes, if not all music theory classes, which is intervals. Alright, so for this part of the video, I'm going to switch to a keyboard because I feel like it'll make it a little easier to visualize what I'm talking about. So in music theory, intervals are used to describe the relationships between two different notes or the space between the two notes. So for example, if I just take two random notes, that would be called a major third, whether you're playing it low to high, high to low, or at the same time. That could be considered an interval. Now, if you're not familiar with the keyboard, you'll notice that there's groupings of 2 black keys and groupings of 3 black keys. So the note directly to the left of the 2 black keys is always C. And you'll notice this pattern repeats all throughout the keyboard, so that means directly to the left of this is also C. That would be called an octave because both of those notes are the same. And of course, it doesn't matter which note you start on. Those are all octaves. So how most music works that we listen to today is that we divide the octave into 12 parts. So in this case, that would be these 12 keys in between those two notes. And each one of those notes in relation to C has its own interval name. The first interval we have is the minor second, or sometimes people also call it the half step or the semitone, and that's just 2 notes right next to each other. And like I said before, it doesn't matter what note you start with, as long as both notes are right next to each other, it's considered a minor second. And this one's usually pretty easy to remember because it has a very dissonant sound to it. Alright, next up we have the major second, or it's also called the whole step or the whole tone, and that would just be the next note up. One common way to memorize this interval is just to use the Happy Birthday song. Those very first two notes are just a major second. Next we have the minor third, which is this. And the way I think of that is that it's the start of a minor chord. If you don't know what a minor chord is, you could just think of that as like the sad sounding chord, as opposed to the happier sounding chord, which is the major chord. And that brings us to our next interval, which is the major third, which is pretty much the same thing with the major chord, it's just the first two notes. And then I usually use the same method for that, it's just like the beginning of a major arpeggio. Next we have what's called a perfect fourth, which sounds like this. Now for this interval, a lot of people like to use this tune to memorize it. The first two notes of that would be a perfect fourth. Now the next one has a lot of different names. I believe the most common name is the tritone. Some people also call it the augmented fourth or the perfect fifth because it's right in between the perfect fourth and the perfect fifth, which is what I'm going to cover next. And this one's pretty easy to remember because it has a very gnarly sound to it. Some people even nickname it the Devil's Interval because of how it sounds. As far as any reference song, pretty much any Metallica riff ever has probably used this interval at some point. Next we got the perfect fifth. Now, as opposed to the tritone, this one's actually very consonant. And when I say consonants, that's the opposite of dissonance. So dissonance means that the notes clash, whereas consonance means that the notes don't clash. Now, if you're a guitar player, this is basically just a power chord, so this will be a really easy interval to remember. Now, this next one's called the minor sixth, and it sounds like this. Now at this point, especially the sixth and the seventh, these intervals start getting a little harder to identify because they're so spaced out compared to the other ones. So at this point, I find it easier to just take songs that you like and try to identify where these intervals are. Like for this minor sixth, one that I used to use back in high school was a Dream Theater song, actually. Those very first two notes in the melody. Actually, let me take it down an octave so you can see what I'm doing. Those very first two notes is a minor sixth. Next we have the major sixth. Now a lot of this kind of sound with the major sixth and minor sixth can actually be heard in a lot of country guitar licks. Now we only have two more to work through, which I'll just show you back to back. The first one is the minor seventh. And then the next one is the major seventh. To me, the major seventh is really easy because whenever I hear that second note, my head always wants this second note to move up one more to the octave. because that's more consonant. So whenever I'm trying to identify that interval, that's pretty much what I hear. And the minor 7 is kind of the same thing, except if you resolve it a half step higher, it still sounds dissonant, so it gets this kind of sound. And of course you can use songs for those as well, that's just what I do. Now, since this channel is for the most part a primarily guitar-based channel, I'm going to show you how to apply these intervals to the guitar. So first, it's really good to know how to play these intervals and what shapes they are on the neck. So let's just take any note. I'm just going to take this D note on the 5th fret of the A string. So first, let's start with the octave. So you may already know this shape. It's just you start on this note, and then from there you go down 2 strings, and then just go up 2 frets. And that would be the octave. So again, you can move it all over the place and it's still an octave, with the exception of the D and the B string, and the G and the E string, because you know you have this, the G and the B string are a major third apart. But anyway, now starting with the minor second, we play, which again, the minor second is just 2 notes right next to each other. And then you can also play them on multiple strings. And then major second, minor third, major third, perfect fourth, tritone, perfect fifth, minor sixth, which you can actually skip a string and play it on the G, and then major sixth, minor 7, and then major 7, and then you have your octave. Now, the reason this is important is because you can use these intervals in order to analyze and create chords and scales and kind of understand how the scales or chords work. So, for example, if you just take a chord that you know, let's just take this chord shape, this bar chord starting on the 5th fret of the A string again. And then if we analyze that chord progression using these shapes, we know that's a perfect fifth. And then next note, that would be an octave. And then from there we have this note, which is an F. If we take that down an octave, that would just be a minor third. And then this last note is just an A, so that's just the perfect fifth again. And since this is a minor chord, that tells you that a minor chord is basically just a root, the minor third, and the perfect fifth. So you can do that with any chord, even like your open chords. And then once you get that down, I'm sure a lot of you have those chords that you don't really know what they are, but they just sound cool, so you play them. Like for me, one for a long time was this chord. But if we analyze that using these intervals, we get to see, first we start on this E, which is the root, and then we go to the perfect fifth. And then if you take this note up here, we bring that down an octave, that's just a minor third. So right now we know it's just a minor chord. And then the last 2 notes, we have this C, which would be the minor 6 from E. And then the other note is this A, which would be the 4th. So what that tells us that that's just a minor chord with an additional minor 6 and a perfect 4th. Now, what knowing these interval shapes also helps us with is connecting chords to scales. So for example, to know what kind of scale we could play over this chord, now that we've analyzed the intervals, we know that it has a minor third and a perfect fifth. So it has to be some kind of minor scale. And then it also has a C and an A, which is a minor sixth and a perfect fourth. So based on that, we know that we can play the minor scale over that. Now say we wanted to play something else like Dorian Mode, which Dorian Mode has a major 6 rather than a minor 6, so we could just raise this C to a C sharp. And then that would be a chord that you could fit this scale into. Now I know that might be kind of advanced and I don't expect you to actually get any of that, but just to show you the extent of which knowing these interval shapes can actually help you once you get into the more advanced theory concepts. So yeah, that's my little brief overview of the concept of intervals, and of course that's a lot of information to take at one time, so I don't expect you to actually know everything about intervals just from watching this little video. I definitely recommend that you go back and take each interval individually and figure out how to play them on your instrument, as well as train your ears to recognize them just by hearing them. And one good resource to do that is there's a website, I think it's actually just called musictheory.net, where they actually have an application where they play you different random intervals, and then you have to identify them just by hearing them. So it's a good way to start your ear training. But anyway, that's all the time I have left for today. I hope you enjoyed watching this. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments. Please like and subscribe if you're interested in more videos like this, and I will catch you all later.